And thanks for being with us here on Morning Live. Advocate Dali Mpofu told Public Enterprises Minister Pravin Gordhan that he did not have any evidence of state capture involvement against former South African Revenue Services, that's SARS Commissioner Tom Moyane. The advocate who represented Moyane made this point at the State Capture Commission yesterday. Mpofu raised 5 accusations that Moyane had stated as the reasons for Gordhan's animosity towards him, which ranged from racism to deflecting from his own involvement in state capture. Now, Moyane also claimed that Gordhan resented him for blowing the whistle on his dealings at SARS, including the formation of the so-called rogue unit during Gordhan's tenure at the Revenue Service. Legal journalist Karryn Maughan joins us right now to discuss this further. Karryn, good morning. Good to see you again, and welcome to Morning Live.
Thank you for having me.
I mean, it was pretty obvious that there was no love lost between Advocate Dali Mpofu and Minister Pravin Gordhan yesterday. But what did you make of it all? Just overall, in terms of how things played out yesterday, what was your assessment?
You know, I think that Advocate Dali Mpofu, in the beginning, got a few important blows in asking Pravin to really define state capture, what it was, and why specifically being accused of it in the context of South Africa was an immensely serious thing, because we know that at the heart of the allegations of state capture really are that you've essentially looted money, engaged in corruption and money laundering with funds that are ultimately to the poor, and that it was almost treasonous. And then off the back of that, really asking the minister to give hard evidence that Tom Moyane, as he put it, was using his very, very important position in SARS as the commissioner to sort of perpetuate this project of state capture, and what evidence he actually had for that. Of course, we know that Gordhan had said that he believed that the case against him, the early retirement, alleged fraud linked to the early retirement of Ivan Pillay, had its genesis in charges or was basically orchestrated or perpetuated by Pravin Gordhan. But Gordhan forced to admit in the early stages of the proceedings yesterday that while Moyane had laid the charges, he hadn't specifically named him, and Mpofu pushing him on that point, trying to say, well, would he have had a valid basis to do so? But in the end of the analysis, things got so utterly petty, vindictive, and nasty that I'm really not sure that anyone came out of yesterday's proceedings looking very good. It became very personal very, very quickly.
Karryn, did you get a sense that Pravin Gordhan successfully answered questions, especially around whether he believed that Moyane was involved in state capture?
I think the point was that he this example that he uses a lot of join the dots, join the dots, join the dots. I mean, he repeated that yesterday. And I think the important thing that Mpofu was trying to bring across was that you can speculate, as a normal person, you can have certain beliefs or ideas about why things are happening. But when you state under oath, as Gordhan has done, that someone is involved or embroiled in state capture corruption, which enters out of the fray of speculation and into the world of, the law, then, Mpofu was arguing you need to have more hardcore evidence than you in fact do. And Gordhan's defense throughout was, well, look at what came out of the Nugent inquiry into SARS, look at what Judge Robert Nugent said about Tom Moyane, etc., etc. And Mpofu simply wasn't accepting that. And unfortunately, the dynamic that emerged, where Pravin Gordhan would give very long answers and very involved answers to quite short questions, where Mpofu would say, but I want you to say yes or no, was this perception, which I think you could see from the people who were picking it up, that there was a dynamic of arrogance and evasion, unfortunately, in his responses. And that may well have been a consequence of the personal dynamic between these two men, but it did not. He did not come across well in yesterday's proceedings. And I don't think there was a sense that he took he took the opportunity to say, well, I didn't necessarily have this hardcore evidence. It was my perception, and I recognize that. Because I think that kind of acceptance of things may have progressed things a bit faster than they did yesterday.
And you touch on the Nugent report there, and that was brought up severally during Minister Pravin Gordhan's responses to Dali Mpofu. But there were other commissions as well, inquiries at SARS. It wasn't just the Nugent report. There was the Karryn report. There was the Skakane report, for example, and one of the auditing firms also getting involved there. So what was the significance for Pravin Gordhan, who kept going back to that specific report as opposed to mentioning what happened in the others as well?
Well, I mean, this is a very interesting point that you're raising here at the moment, because Judge Karryn, as during the course of the Nugent investigation withdrew his report. We know KPMG also disavowed their report. Musi Sekakane, we know now under pressure from SARS Commissioner Edward Kisveta to withdraw his report, in which he said, well, he questioned whether or not there was actually a basis in law for the so-called rogue unit, saying, look, you need to base this on a particular legislation, or necessarily find legislation which would legally justify this or come up with it. And of course, we know as a consequence there were all these other investigations. But Pravin Gordhan saying, I think yesterday, that Musi Sekakane's report will now be the subject of a legal review, or is the subject of a legal review. As far as I know, that is not necessarily the case. But you are correct. I mean, and Sekakane, having said last week or the week before that he will not withdraw his report, it is not for him to do so, it is for SARS. So you are correct. This isn't a clean space. It isn't a clear area of debate where there's a good guy and a bad guy. There were a number of different findings, some of which have been withdrawn, some are standing, some are allegedly up for review. And in the context of that, one needs to be very, very careful about whole-scale dismissing things as simply baseless. We know also, Sakina, that Pravin Gordhan is in the process of reviewing the Public Protector's report on the so-called rogue unit, which he has gone out and accused her of and the Ivan Pillay matter, and gone out and made similar accusations about her doing that investigation as part of a so-called fight back campaign by those involved in state capture. And as in this case, she's also said to him, well, you need to prove that. You can't simply make these allegations without necessarily having an evidential basis to do so.
So, Karyn, just on a point of clarity, the whole issue around the so-called rogue unit, is this the pushback from those who are accused by Gordhan and those who may be in the same camp as he is, for lack of a better description, of state capture against those who were allied to Zuma, for example?
I think absolutely so. I mean, the nature of the ANC is extremely factional, and I think Pravin Gordhan, is arguably one of the most targeted people, within that Ramaphosa faction. We know that he's come under fire most recently because of his, stance, particularly on SAA, but. The nature of factional dynamics within South Africa played itself out in the inquiry room yesterday, and one cannot be oblivious to that. But what's unfortunate, Sakina, is that we see these kind of factional dynamics, whether it's the former president declining to answer questions because he feels that the inquiry is part of a deliberate, campaign against him to discredit his leadership, part of a foreign intelligence plot on one side, and Pravin Gordhan believing that the questions against him really have no substance or no basis because they form part of a plot to eviscerate the opponents of state capture. In the end of the day, there was a great quote by an American politician who said, you can question my judgment, but as soon as you question my motives, there's no way that, you can come to a reasonable agreement, or you can have a system of accountability that is operational and functional. And that is what we're seeing here. That both of these individuals very reluctant to engage in processes because they believe that the questions they're being asked are not legitimate, or that the process itself is not legitimate. And that, of course, means that ordinary South Africans don't get the answers that they would necessarily want out of those particular processes.
And some of these answers, I, for example, don't quite understand why they are so difficult to come by. If you look at the so-called rogue unit, for example, Karyn, it's a simple question. Either this unit was operating within the prescripts and confines of a legislation and the law, or it wasn't and was therefore unlawful or rogue, if you will. So given the testimony, the evidence that has been led so far, given what we know about what is in the public domain about this unit and how it was set up, it should be a simple, straightforward answer. Was this unit rogue or not?
Well, I think as in all things in South Africa, it's not necessarily simple, precisely because Muzi Sekakane has not withdrawn his report. I'm not sure, whether Kisveta will now embark on a process of legal review to have it set aside, because as you rightly point out, Muzi Sekakane's exact point was, look, I'm not sure that there is a legal basis for you to have this unit, as it currently stands. You maybe need to look at which legislation would be appropriate. The legislation at this point doesn't exist. Maybe you need to, generate legislation or find a legal basis. And that was his primary point, which, of course, sparked a whole bunch of other investigations. So the legality of the unit is very much up for debate. What unfortunately muddied the waters even further was that there was a great deal of reporting by the Sunday Times suggesting that the unit ran a brothel, that they were spying on then President Zuma, that they were engaged in a whole lot of unlawful activities, unlawful surveillance, etc., etc. And the NPA, at one stage, going to pursue that prosecution and then withdrawing it because they felt that there wasn't a basis to do so. So there was a lot of stuff that there were a lot of allegations that were made that seemed to have no real substance to them. But the primary issue of whether or not there was a legal foundation to this unit being formed and the consequences of that is still very much alive, whether it is in the public protector, the Gordhan review of the public protector's report. That judgment will be very central. And it will also be if Edward Kisweta does indeed elect to take Muzi Sekakane's report on review. So it's not a simple answer, but certainly the findings of Sekakane was that there wasn't a legal basis necessarily for the formation of the rogue unit, and simply raising concern about that. And all these years later, we now sit where we sit.
And that goes back to 2007, Karyn. And I'm just looking at this memo that was sent out by then Commissioner of SARS, Pravin Gordhan, in which he clearly states that this capability that SARS wanted needed support, and it needed to be established within the National Intelligence Agency, and therefore requested funding from the Minister of Finance for the NIA. Goes on to say in 2.3, we therefore request the NIA's budget be increased to fund the creation of this special capability. And before that, in stating the purpose, he says, this is to seek approval to fund a special capability within the NIA to supply SARS and law enforcement with the necessary information to address the illicit economy. And the activity, therefore, would be located within the NIA, because he goes on to say it's because this is an activity for which SARS does not presently have the capability, including the legislative mandate, to manage clandestine activity. So by his own admission, at the time when they are envisaging setting up this unit, Pravin Gordhan admits that that capability needs to sit within the National Intelligence Agency, and that the legislative framework does not allow for SARS to actually do said activity. So if the unit was set up, and this is what I'm grappling with, why isn't it clear cut? Why isn't it so simple to say, but hold up, you actually were set up unlawfully, or you were operating unlawfully? Why is this? Why are the waters so muddied?
Well, I mean, you raised the exact important point, was that this was meant to be a joint operation between the National Intelligence Agency at the time and SARS. And, you know, I've spoken to the former minister, Ronnie Casrals, about that. And for whatever reason, that agreement disintegrated. And the unit then carried out these activities. They saying, look, we were very concerned about the illicit economy. This was ultimately about us being able to do our job. But you have hit the nail on the head. Did they have the legislation or the legislative foundation in which to do this? And that was essentially Sekhakhane finding that they didn't. So, you know, the subsequent debates that have emerged about, you know, whether or not you know, this rogue unit was in fact rogue, I think is a bit of a red herring. Because, you know, whether or not the factual issue of how they were founded and why they were founded, specifically around the legislation and the prescripts that would have enabled them to do what they did, is very much at the heart of those legal debates at the moment. And I don't think it's a clear-cut issue at all, simply because there's a mire of different legal opinion. There are people coming at all angles from it. And I think that ultimately I would welcome any decision by Edward Kieswetter to take Sekhakhane's report on review and get what the court says, specifically on this issue of the legislation, because I think that Sekhakhane was, you know, especially when one reads that 2007 letter that you've just read, there are still major question marks as to, you know, the legislative basis of it. And specifically why NIA was so reluctant as well to get involved in this. And just finally, Karyn, very briefly, you know, these are two people now, Tom Moyane and, of course, Pravin Gordhan, who worked at SARS at different times. In your observation and analysis, how would you view their roles in light of the information that has now been made public, that is in the public domain, and the significance, of course, of this cross-examination at this time in South Africa? I think the important thing is that Tom Moyane has said he will come and testify himself. He will face, questions about his management of a leadership of SARS, and specifically address these allegations that have been leveled against him by Pravin Gordhan. Of course, he maintains he's never met the Guptas. He was not involved in state capture. He was doing his job, but there are real question marks over certain decisions that were taken by him as at SARS at the time, and the kind of economic repercussions that they have had further down the line, certainly in terms of tax compliance and other issues. He claims he was the most successful commissioner in South African history, and that is why Gordhan is jealous of him. But he, of course, will deal with those kind of averments if and when he comes and testifies, which will probably be next year. But I personally found yesterday's proceedings, certainly sensational and interesting. You were grabbing the popcorn, but ultimately it was about, the kind of conduct that one would expect of people in a functional democracy and an inquiry process. And unfortunately, I don't think that our democracy looked particularly functional yesterday, where, simple questions, because of the kind of factional dynamics that rage at the moment, because of the kind of issues of what was legal, what wasn't, just embroiling in kind of a huge, amorphous, personal fight that subsumed much of the proceedings, and which the DCJ Raymond Zondo often struggled to control. So as an ordinary South African person, it may have been entertaining, but it was certainly concerning when one thinks about what this inquiry is meant to investigate, how little time it has to do so, and the fact that we don't really have a clear sense of what the point of yesterday actually was.
Karyn Maughan, as always, great to speak to you. Thank you so much. Legal journalist Karyn Maughan talking to us about yesterday's proceedings at the state capture inquiry, where Public Enterprise Minister Pravin Gordhan was cross-examined by former SARS Commissioner Moyane's legal team headed up by Advocate Dali Mpofu.